Welcome to this journey into the shadows of American history, where the line between survival and savagery becomes terrifyingly blurred. Before we begin, I want you to do something for me. Write in the comments below where you are right now and what time it is as you watch this. Are you alone? Are you somewhere warm and safe? Because the story we're about to explore happened in a place where warmth and safety were luxuries that two people lost forever in the winter of 1907. This is a story that was deliberately buried, a story that authorities in Colorado wanted forgotten, but fragments remain. Pages torn from official records, a diary with entries that made seasoned investigators physically ill. Testimonies from mountain men who stumbled upon something that haunted them until their dying days. In the spring of 1907, when the snow finally began to melt in the high country of the Colorado Rockies, a postal inspector named William Davies made a routine check on an isolated homestead, approximately 18 miles northwest of the mining town of Silverton, the Hartwell cabin, home to two siblings who had been granted a small land claim 3 years prior. Davies had not received any correspondence from the Hartwells since October of the previous year. This was not entirely unusual. Winter in the Rockies could be brutal, isolating, absolute. But something about the silence troubled him. Perhaps it was the rumors that had begun circulating in Silverton, whispers from trappers, about strange lights in the high country, about screams carried on the wind during the darkest months. When Davies reached the cabin on April 3rd, 1907, he found the door partially open. Snow had drifted inside. The interior was dark and cold, and carried a smell that he would later describe in his official report as the sweetest rot imaginable, like spoiled pork left in summer heat, but worse, much worse, because of what it meant. What he discovered inside that cabin would lead to one of the most disturbing cases in Colorado history, a case that was quickly sealed by territorial authorities, a case that involved two orphan siblings, Thomas Hartwell, 29 years old, and his younger sister Eleanor, 26. A case that would reveal the horrifying lengths to which human beings will go when pushed beyond the breaking point of starvation and isolation. But this is not simply a story about cannibalism, though that horror is certainly part of what happened in that cabin during the winter of 1906 to 1907. This is a story about something even more transgressive, something that the authorities of the time found so disturbing that they chose to bury it rather than prosecute it publicly. This is the story of a pact between siblings, a pact born of desperation, sealed in the darkness of a mountain winter and written in Eleanor Hartwell's own hand in a diary that would later be locked away in a basement archive of the Colorado State Hospital for the Insane. The Hartwell case touches on taboos that we rarely discuss even today. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature, about what we're capable of when stripped of civilization, when reduced to our most primal instincts. Over the next hour, we'll reconstruct what happened in that cabin. We'll read passages from Eleanor's diary. We'll examine the official records that survived the attempted cover-up. We'll hear the testimonies of those who knew the Hartwells and those who investigated their crimes. But I want to warn you now, this is not entertainment. This is not fiction designed to titillate. Every detail you're about to hear is drawn from historical records, though some names and specific locations have been altered out of respect for descendants who still live in Colorado. What happened to Thomas and Eleanor Hartwell is a tragedy. But it's also a horror story. And like all true horror stories, it reveals something about the darkness that exists not in monsters or demons, but in ourselves. The winter of 1907 was one of the coldest on record in the Colorado Rockies. Snowfall began in October and didn't stop until late March. The Hartwell siblings were snowed in by mid-November with provisions they believed would last until January. They were wrong. By December, they were starving. By January, they had crossed the first line. By February, they had crossed them all. This is their story. To understand what happened in the Hartwell cabin, we must first understand the world that Thomas and Eleanor inhabited. The Colorado of 1907 was still, in many ways, a frontier. Statehood had been achieved only 31 years prior. The mountains were populated by miners, homesteaders, trappers, and those seeking to escape the complications of civilized life. Thomas and Eleanor Hartwell were children of this harsh landscape. Born in Denver to Swedish immigrants, they lost their mother to tuberculosis in 1885 when Thomas was 7 and Eleanor was 4. Their father, Gustav Hartwell, worked in the silver mines near Leadville, a brutal occupation that left him injured and unable to work by 1889. He died in 1892, leaving the children in the care of an aunt who ran a boarding house in Colorado Springs. According to census records and what few letters survive, Thomas and Eleanor were unusually close from childhood. Their aunt, Martha Lindgren, noted in a letter to a cousin in 1895 that the children clung to each other as though they were two halves of a single soul, rarely speaking to others, always whispering together in corners. This closeness was interpreted by some as touching devotion between orphaned siblings. By others, even then, as something less innocent. A schoolteacher in Colorado Springs, whose diary was later examined by researchers, wrote in 1896 that the Hartwell children have an intensity in their gaze toward one another that troubles me, though I cannot say precisely why. Thomas left school at 14 to work. Eleanor was kept home by their aunt, who was growing increasingly disturbed by the girl's strangeness and inappropriate attachment to her brother. In 1899, when Thomas turned 21, he and Eleanor left Colorado Springs without warning. They simply disappeared one autumn night, taking with them only what they could carry. They resurfaced in Silverton in 1904, presenting themselves to the land office as siblings seeking a homestead claim. The clerk, Harold Pemberton, remembered them clearly even decades later. In a 1952 interview conducted by a local historian, Pemberton recalled, "They stood very close together, so close their shoulders touched. The brother did all the talking. The sister never looked away from him, not once. I remember thinking they seemed afraid of something, though what I couldn't say." The land they claimed was remote, even by the standards of the time. 18 miles from Silverton, accessible only by a rough trail that became impassable in heavy snow. The cabin had been built by a prospector who died the previous winter. It was small, roughly 20 feet by 15 feet, with a stone fireplace, a single room, and a loft accessed by a ladder. Why did they choose such isolation? The official records offer no answer. But Eleanor's diary, which begins in October 1904, provides some insight. In one of the earliest entries, she writes, "Thomas says we will be safe here, that no one will find us, that we can finally be what we are without shame or fear." What did she mean by what we are? The diary does not immediately clarify, but the implications are troubling. The Hartwells lived quietly for 2 years. They raised chickens, kept a small vegetable garden during the brief summer months, and relied on Thomas's hunting skills for meat. They came to Silverton only twice a year to purchase supplies: flour, salt, sugar, kerosene, ammunition. They spoke to no one beyond what was necessary for commerce. A storekeeper named Benjamin Voss noted in his ledger in July 1906, "Hartwells purchased double their usual supply of flour and dried beans. Brother mentioned expecting a hard winter. Sister stood by the window the entire time, looking out at the mountains as though she could already see the snow coming." Voss was right to note this. The winter of 1906-1907 would be remembered as one of the most severe in Colorado history. Meteorological records from the period show that snowfall in the San Juan Mountains exceeded normal levels by nearly 200%. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Fahrenheit and remained there for weeks at a time. The Hartwells made their last appearance in Silverton on October 12, 1906. They purchased standard supplies and left town before noon. A trapper named John Kavanaugh encountered them on the trail, heading back into the mountains. This would be the last confirmed sighting of the Hartwells together. Kavanaugh later testified that they seemed anxious to get home, as though pursued. He also noted something else, something he was reluctant to mention, but which investigators pressed him on. The sister was carrying herself different, like she was protecting her belly. I thought maybe she was with child, but that made no sense, them living alone up there. The snow began falling on October 28, 1906. By November 15th, the trail to the Hartwell cabin would have been completely impassable. They were alone, cut off, trapped in a small wooden structure with whatever provisions they had, managed to gather. And according to Eleanor's diary, those provisions were not enough, not nearly enough. The diary entries from November are relatively mundane, descriptions of daily routines, the beauty of the snow, Thomas's success in shooting a deer on November 3rd. But by mid-November, a new tone begins to creep into the writing. Anxiety, concern about the depth of the snow, worry that the deer meat would not last. On November 22nd, she writes, "Thomas says we must ration carefully. The Isle chickens are dead, frozen in the night despite the fire we kept. We have only the deer, the beans and the flour. He says it will be enough. I want to believe him. I must believe him." By December, belief was no longer enough. The last normal entry in Eleanor's diary is dated December 8, 1906. After that, the handwriting begins to change. The words become more fragmented, the content more disturbing. This is where our story truly begins. In the darkness of that December, when the temperature dropped below zero and stayed there, when the snow piled higher than the cabin windows, when two people realized that they were going to starve to death unless they did something unthinkable. Multiple things, actually. Things that would damn them both. The first indication that something had gone terribly wrong in the Hartwell cabin appears in Eleanor's diary on December 14th, 1906. The entry is brief, almost cryptic. "We are down to less than a week of flour. The last of the deer is gone. Thomas went out in the snow to check the traps. He came back with nothing. His face frightens me, or perhaps it is my own face reflected in his eyes that truly frightens me." 3 days later, December 17th. "We are eating once a day now, a thin gruel made from the last of the beans. Thomas says we must save our strength, but for what? We cannot leave. The snow is above the door. We dug our way out this morning just to gather firewood from the pile outside. The cold is like knives. If we tried to walk to Silverton, we would die within hours. We are trapped, completely and utterly trapped." The meteorological records support this. In mid-December 1906, a massive storm system stalled over the San Juan Mountains. Snowfall was measured in feet per day. Temperatures remained between -15 and -25 degrees Fahrenheit. Anyone caught outside without shelter would have frozen to death quickly. But here is where the mystery truly begins. Because on December 23, 1906, Eleanor's diary takes a turn that even hardened investigators found difficult to process. She writes, "Thomas held me last night, not as a brother holds a sister. He wept as he did it, and I wept too. But neither of us could stop. We are already damned," he said, "already lost. What does one more sin matter when we are going to die here anyway?" I had no answer. I have no answers anymore. There is only the cold and the hunger and the terrible fact of his body against mine. This entry was used by prosecutors in the brief, sealed hearing that followed Eleanor's committal to the asylum. It was presented as evidence of incest. But some historians who have studied the case argue that we must understand the context. Two people, slowly starving, completely isolated, facing what they believed was certain death. The boundaries of normal human behavior begin to dissolve under such conditions. This is not to excuse what happened, but perhaps to understand it. Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. Do you believe extreme circumstances can push people beyond moral boundaries? Or are there lines that should never be crossed, regardless of the situation? The diary entries between December 23rd and January 10th are increasingly fragmentary and disturbing. Eleanor writes about the physical relationship continuing. She writes about guilt and shame, but also about comfort, about the warmth of another body in the freezing darkness. She writes about hallucinations brought on by hunger, about seeing their dead parents standing in the corners of the cabin, about hearing voices in the wind. On January 7th, she writes, "I believe I am with child. This should horrify me more than it does, but I feel only numbness. Thomas does not know yet. I am afraid to tell him, afraid of what it will mean, afraid that this new life growing inside me will consume the last of my strength and kill me before the spring comes." But she did tell him, and according to her diary, Thomas's reaction was not what she expected. January 12th. Thomas says the baby is a sign that we are meant to survive, that God or fate or whatever governs this world wants us to live. He has become obsessed with keeping me alive, with keeping the baby alive. He goes out into the snow every day now, checking traps that remain empty, searching for any source of food. Yesterday he brought back bark from a pine tree. We boiled it and drank the water. It tasted like poison, but we drank it anyway. The medical reality is grim. By mid-January, both Thomas and Eleanor would have been suffering from severe malnutrition. Starvation affects the body in stages. First, the body burns through its fat reserves. Then it begins to consume muscle tissue. Cognitive function deteriorates. Hallucinations and delusions become common. The body literally begins to digest itself. For Eleanor, pregnancy would have accelerated this process. The developing fetus would have drawn what few nutrients remained in her system. She was, in effect, being consumed from within, even as she starved from without. On January 28th, Eleanor's diary records the first death. The baby is gone. I woke this morning to blood and pain and the knowledge that the life inside me had ended. Thomas buried the remains outside in the snow. He dug with his bare hands until they bled. He would not let me see what he buried. Afterward, he sat by the fire and did not speak for hours. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were different, empty, or perhaps filled with something I do not want to name. This is the moment, investigators would later conclude, when Thomas Hartwell crossed the final line. Eleanor's next diary entry is dated February 3rd, 1907, 6 days after she recorded the miscarriage. Thomas came back today with meat. I did not ask where he got it. I did not want to know. We cooked it over the fire and ate it, and it was the most delicious thing I have ever tasted. I hate myself for thinking that. I hate myself for eating it. But I ate every bite. I am still alive. The baby is gone, but I am still alive. And I ate the meat without asking where it came from. The diary does not explicitly state what the meat was, but the implications are clear. Investigators who later examined the cabin found no evidence of any game animals, no hides, no bones that could be attributed to deer or elk or rabbits. What they did find, buried in the snow approximately 50 feet from the cabin, were partial human remains, a femur, fragments of a rib cage, a small skull, The skull was that of an infant, approximately 5 to 6 months of gestational age. Medical examiners in 1907 concluded that the remains were consistent with Eleanor's miscarriage. But here is what haunts this case, what makes it infinitely more disturbing than a simple story of survival cannibalism. The bones showed signs of butchering, clean cuts made with a sharp blade, the kind of cuts you make when you're processing meat. Thomas had not buried his unborn child out of grief or respect. He had processed it, and he had fed it to his sister without telling her what it was. This is the horror at the heart of the Hartwell case. Not simply that they resorted to cannibalism under extreme duress, but that Thomas made the conscious decision to feed Eleanor her own miscarried child, and that he continued to provide meat throughout February and into March, meat that Eleanor accepted without question because the alternative was death. Where did this meat come from? The diary provides clues, terrible clues, that suggest Thomas did not stop with the fetus. February 9th. Thomas was gone all night. I heard him leave after I fell asleep. He came back at dawn with more meat. His clothes were covered in blood and snow. He would not look at me, just put the meat on the table and went to sleep by the fire. I should not eat it. I know I should not eat it. But I am so hungry. God forgive me. I am so hungry. February 14th. I saw boots outside today. When I asked Thomas about them, he said they belonged to him, but I know all of Thomas's boots. These were not his. They were smaller, newer, someone else's boots, and they were covered in blood. The truth was beginning to dawn on Eleanor, and she was too terrified, or perhaps too hungry, to confront it directly. The horrifying reality of what Thomas Hartwell had become is spelled out most clearly in Eleanor's diary entry from February 21st, 1907. I confronted him. Today, I demanded to know where the meat was coming from. He looked at me for a long time with those empty eyes. Then he said, "Does it matter? You're alive, aren't you? The baby is gone, but you're alive. That's all that matters now." I screamed at him. I called him a murderer, a monster. He did not deny it. He simply said, "I'm your brother. I will keep you alive no matter what it costs." The subsequent entries reveal the full scope of Thomas's actions during February 1907, using information from Eleanor's diary, combined with evidence found at the scene and in the surrounding area during the spring thaw. Investigators were able to piece together a timeline of murder. On or around February the 2nd, approximately 1 week after Eleanor's miscarriage, Thomas set out from the cabin during a brief break in the weather. He did not go hunting for animals. He went hunting for human prey. The San Juan Mountains, even in winter, were not entirely deserted. Trappers still worked their lines. The occasional prospector, desperate or foolish enough to brave the cold, might be found in the high country. And there were always a few travelers, people trying to move between settlements despite the dangers. Thomas knew the trails. He knew where someone traveling alone might pass. And he waited. The first victim was a trapper named Samuel Dietrich. His disappearance was not reported until March, when he failed to deliver his winter pelts to the trading post in Silverton. A subsequent search of his usual trapline found his shelter abandoned, but no sign of Dietrich himself. What investigators found instead, months later, was Dietrich's frozen campsite approximately 3 miles from the Hartwell cabin. Evidence suggested he had been attacked while sleeping. A struggle had occurred, blood in the snow, drag marks leading away from the site. And at the Hartwell cabin, among the belongings later catalogued, were items that matched descriptions of Dietrich's possessions: a distinctive knife with a carved handle, a tobacco pouch embroidered with his initials, and a pair of snowshoes. The boots Eleanor saw outside the cabin on February 14th likely belonged to Dietrich. But he was not the only victim. Eleanor's diary mentions Thomas leaving the cabin multiple times in February. on February 8th, on February 11th, on February 16th, on February 22nd. Each time he returned with meat. Each time Eleanor ate it despite her growing horror at its source. On February 25th, she writes, "I am a cannibal. There is no other word for it. I have eaten human flesh. I have eaten it repeatedly. I have eaten it knowing what it is. And God help me, I am grateful for it because it has kept me alive. What kind of monster does that make me? What kind of creatures have we become in this cabin? The question haunts the entire case. Eleanor was a victim of circumstances beyond her control, but she was also a participant. She ate the meat Thomas provided. She did not refuse it, even when she knew or strongly suspected its origin. Does knowledge without action constitute guilt? The courts of 1907 never had to answer that question definitively. The case was sealed before it could go to trial, but we can examine the evidence and form our own conclusions. In Eleanor's diary, we find a woman torn between survival instinct and moral horror. She describes nightmares where the meat she's eating transforms into human hands and faces. She describes waking in the night to vomit, only to eat again at the next meal because the alternative is starvation. On March 1st, 1907, she writes what may be the most psychologically complex entry in the entire diary. "Thomas asked me today if I hated him. I told him I should hate him, that any decent person would hate him for what he's done, for what he's made me. But the truth, the terrible truth I cannot say aloud, is that I love him more now than ever before. Because he has kept his promise. He said he would keep me alive, and he has. At what cost? At the cost of his own soul. He has damned himself to save me. What kind of love is that? What kind of devotion? It terrifies me and fills me with a gratitude so profound I could weep forever." This entry was used by the examining physicians at the Colorado State Hospital for the Insane as evidence of Eleanor's fundamental psychological break. They diagnosed her with what they termed moral insanity and melancholia with delusions. In modern terms, we might recognize severe trauma, PTSD, and perhaps a form of Stockholm Syndrome directed not at a captor, but at her own brother. When Postal Inspector William Davies entered the Hartwell cabin on April 3rd, 1907, he found Eleanor alone. She was sitting at the small wooden table, the diary open in front of her, a pen in her hand. She looked up at him without apparent recognition. Davies would later testify that Eleanor appeared to have aged decades. Her hair, which in previous years had been dark brown, was now streaked with white. Her face was gaunt, skeletal. Her eyes, he said, looked through me rather than at me, as though I were no more substantial than the dust motes in the air. The interior of the cabin was in disarray. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers. Dried blood stained the wooden floor in multiple locations, and the smell, that terrible smell Davies had detected from outside, was overwhelming within the enclosed space. Davies identified himself and asked where Thomas was. Eleanor did not respond. She simply returned her attention to the diary and continued writing. Davies explored the cabin. In the loft, he found dried meat hanging from hooks. At first, he assumed it was venison or elk, but the shape was wrong, too uniform. And when he looked closer, he saw what appeared to be a human hand, partially preserved in the cold, hanging among the other cuts. He descended the ladder and attempted to question Eleanor again. This time she spoke. According to Davies's official report, she said, "Only, he's gone hunting. He'll be back soon with more food. We always need more food." Davies left the cabin and searched the surrounding area. What he found would form the core of the physical evidence in the case. Approximately 50 feet behind the cabin, in a small depression that had been used as a refuse pit, were human remains. partial skeletons of at least 2 adult males, later identified through personal effects as Samuel Dietrich and a prospector named Karl Messner, who had been reported missing in mid-February. The bones showed evidence of butchering. Skulls had been cracked open to access the brain matter. Long bones had been split to extract marrow. And buried separately, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, were the tiny bones of an infant. Davies also found tracks in the snow, fresh tracks made within the last day or two, leading away from the cabin toward the higher elevations. Someone had left recently. Thomas, presumably, though Davies never saw him. A search party was organized. Men from Silverton, experienced trackers and mountain men, followed the trail for 3 days. It led higher into the Rockies, into terrain that was barely navigable even in summer. On the 3rd day, the tracks simply vanished near a cliff face above a frozen river. The searchers concluded that Thomas had either fallen to his death or deliberately jumped. But no body was ever recovered. The spring melt that year was heavy, and the river would have carried anything over the falls and into the canyons below. Thomas Hartwell was declared legally dead in absentia in October 1907, but some who participated in the search maintained until their dying days that the tracks didn't look like someone who had fallen. They looked like someone who knew exactly where he was going and had chosen to disappear. Eleanor was taken into custody on April 3rd. She did not resist. She did not speak except to ask repeatedly when Thomas would return. The diary was confiscated as evidence. The cabin was sealed, and Eleanor was transported under guard to the Colorado State Hospital for the insane in Pueblo. What happened next is one of the most troubling aspects of the Hartwell case, from a historical and legal perspective. The case was never brought to public trial. Instead, a sealed hearing was conducted in May 1907, attended only by a territorial judge, 2 court-appointed physicians, a prosecuting attorney, and a stenographer whose transcript has never been publicly released. What we know about the hearing comes from fragments, notes in the judge's private papers discovered in the 1960s, brief mentions in letters between territorial officials, and the testimony of one of the physicians, Dr. Harold Reeves, who late in his life spoke to a historian about the case. According to Dr. Reeves, the hearing lasted less than 3 hours. Eleanor was brought in from the asylum, heavily sedated. She was not represented by counsel. The prosecution presented the diary as evidence, reading selected passages aloud. They presented the physical evidence from the cabin, the preserved meat identified as human, the butchered bones, the personal effects of the missing men. The physicians testified that Eleanor was suffering from severe mental deterioration and was unfit to stand trial. But more than that, they argued that a public trial would be detrimental to public morals. The details of the case, they suggested, were too disturbing, too transgressive to be aired in open court. The judge agreed. Eleanor was remanded permanently to the asylum. The case was sealed under a territorial statute that allowed for the suppression of records in cases involving moral turpitude of an extreme and corrupting nature. The official record states only that Eleanor Hartwell was committed for melancholia and delusions following the death of her brother Thomas Hartwell in a winter accident, 1907. There is no mention of cannibalism, no mention of incest, no mention of murder. Why the cover-up? Dr. Reeves suggested several reasons. First, the territorial government was eager to attract settlers and investment to Colorado. A highly publicized case of incest and cannibalism would have been disastrous for Colorado's reputation. Second, there was genuine concern that the details of the case might inspire similar acts, a fear that seems absurd now, but was taken seriously in 1907. Third, and perhaps most significant, there was the matter of Eleanor's pregnancy. The diary made clear that Eleanor had become pregnant by her brother, that she had miscarried, and that Thomas had then cannibalized the fetus. These facts, presented in open court, would have created a sensation that authorities were desperate to avoid. So Eleanor Hartwell was quietly locked away. The cabin was burned to the ground by order of the territorial marshal. The few witnesses who knew the full story were strongly encouraged to remain silent, and the official narrative became a simple tragedy. Two siblings isolated by winter, the brother dying in an accident, and the sister losing her mind from grief and isolation. Only Eleanor's diary remained as testimony to the truth, and it was locked in a basement vault of the asylum, where it stayed for decades. Eleanor herself never spoke again. According to asylum records, she spent her 3 remaining years in silence. She ate when fed, she followed basic instructions, but she never uttered another word. Attendants reported that she would sometimes sit for hours, staring at her hands, turning them over and over, as though looking for something she couldn't find. She died on June 12, 1910, of pneumonia. She was 29 years old. Her death certificate lists no next of kin. She was buried in the asylum cemetery under a marker that reads only E.H. 1881-1910. But her story did not end there. Because in the decades that followed, fragments of the truth began to surface. And with those fragments came new questions, new mysteries, and disturbing suggestions that perhaps the horror of the Hartwell cabin had not died with Eleanor after all. The Hartwell case might have remained completely buried if not for a series of discoveries made between 1938 and 1974. These discoveries, scattered across decades, gradually reconstructed the truth and raised new, troubling possibilities about the fate of Thomas Hartwell. The first discovery came in 1938, when the Colorado State Hospital for the Insane in Pueblo underwent renovations. Workers clearing out a storage room in the basement discovered several boxes of old patient records dating back to the early 1900s. Among these records was Eleanor Hartwell's diary. A young psychiatric resident named Dr. Margaret Foster was assigned to catalogue the materials. She later said that reading Eleanor's diary was one of the most disturbing experiences of her career. She brought it to the attention of her supervisor, who immediately recognized the historical significance and the explosive nature of the contents. The diary was turned over to the Colorado Historical Society with the recommendation that it be sealed for 50 years. But Dr. Foster had made copies of key passages, which she kept in her personal files. After her death in 1972, these copies were found by her daughter and eventually donated to the University of Colorado archives. It was through these copies that researchers in the 1980s first began to reconstruct the true story of the Hartwell case. But the diary was not the only piece of evidence that surfaced over the years. In 1951, a forest ranger named Thomas Kelly was conducting a survey in the high country near where the Hartwell cabin had once stood. In a cave approximately 5 miles from the cabin site, he discovered what appeared to be a makeshift shelter. Inside were the remains of a campfire, some rusted tools, and carved into the cave wall, a message. The message read, "Eleanor, forgive me. I could not stop. God help me. I could not stop. Th. July 1907. This discovery suggested something extraordinary and terrifying. Thomas Hartwell had not died in the winter of 1907. He had survived. He had been alive at least until July, 3 months after Eleanor's discovery and committal. Kelly reported the find to authorities, but the cave was remote and difficult to access. By the time a proper investigation could be mounted in 1952, a rock slide had partially collapsed the cave entrance. The inscription was photographed, but much of the interior was now inaccessible. The handwriting in the photograph was compared to samples from Thomas Hartwell's land claim documents from 1904. According to a handwriting expert consulted by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation in 1953, the similarities were highly suggestive but not conclusive. If Thomas had survived until at least July 1907, where had he been? What had he been doing? And what did he mean by, "I could not stop"? In 1962, a historian named Dr. Edward Milhouse was researching mining accidents in the San Juan Mountains for a book on Colorado industrial history. While reviewing old newspapers from the Silverton area, he came across a brief article from August 1907 that had nothing to do with mining. The article, published in the Silverton Standard on August 14, 1907, reported that a shepherd grazing sheep in the high country had found human remains in a remote gulch. The remains were described as recent, showing evidence of predation by animals. The victim could not be identified. Local authorities concluded it was likely a prospector or trapper who had met with an accident. But what caught Dr. Milhouse's attention was a detail mentioned in the final paragraph. Near the remains, searchers had found evidence of a campsite and butchering, though no animal carcasses were present. Dr. Milhouse contacted the Silverton Sheriff's Department, but records from 1907 had long since been destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1923. He did, however, interview the grandson of the shepherd who had made the discovery. The grandson, then in his 70s, recalled his grandfather telling the story. According to the grandson, his grandfather had been deeply disturbed by what he found. The human remains had not been attacked by animals after death. They had been systematically butchered while the person was still alive or shortly after death. And the campsite showed signs of recent occupation. "My grandfather said it looked like someone had been living there, hunting people," the grandson told Dr. Milhouse. "He said he found pieces of clothing from different folks and bones that didn't all belong to the same person. He was scared enough that he never went back to that part of the mountains again." The location of this discovery was approximately 12 miles northeast of where the Hartwell cabin had stood. A difficult but not impossible distance to travel over the course of spring and summer. Was Thomas Hartwell still hunting, and killing months after Eleanor had been taken into custody? The evidence is circumstantial but disturbing. In 1967, another piece of the puzzle emerged. A woman named Sarah Hartwell Morrison contacted the Colorado Historical Society, claiming to be the great-niece of Thomas and Eleanor Hartwell. She had been researching her family genealogy and had stumbled upon references to the siblings that had been carefully omitted from official family records. Sarah had also inherited a box of letters and papers from her grandmother, the sister of Thomas and Eleanor's father. Among these papers was a letter dated November 1907, written by someone who signed only as T. The letter was fragmentary and difficult to read, written on rough paper with what appeared to be charcoal. It read in part, "I am still in the mountains, I cannot come down. I have become something that should not exist among civilized people. Eleanor is gone, and I am glad she does not have to see what I have become. The hunger never left me. Even when there was food, I still felt it. The hunger for that particular meat. I tried to stop. God knows I tried. But I am alone here, and there is no one to judge me but the mountains and the sky. I think perhaps I will stay here forever. Perhaps this is my penance, to live in this cold place and to do what I do until the mountains finally take me." The letter was never sent. It was found, according to family law, tucked inside a Bible that had been mailed to the family from Silverton in late 1907, with no return address and no explanation. Handwriting analysis conducted in 1968 was inconclusive, but noted significant similarities to Thomas Hartwell's known writing samples. The final major discovery came in 1974, when a team of hikers stumbled upon a skeleton in a remote canyon approximately 25 miles from the original Hartwell homestead. The skeleton was partially covered by rock and earth, suggesting it had been buried or had been concealed by natural processes over time. The skeleton was that of a male, estimated to be in his late 20s or early 30s at time of death. Cause of death could not be determined due to the deterioration of the remains, but forensic analysis dated the bones to approximately 1907-1910 based on the degradation and the artifacts found nearby. Those artifacts included a rusted knife, the remnants of clothing consistent with the period, and a small metal locket. Inside the locket was a photograph, badly damaged, but still partially visible. It showed two young people, a man and a woman, standing very close together. On the back of the photograph, in faded ink, was written, "Thomas and Eleanor, 1904. Was this Thomas Hartwell? Had he finally died, alone in the mountains, years after his sister's death? The remains were too degraded for definitive identification through the methods available in 1974. DNA analysis was decades away from being a practical forensic tool. The remains were given a pauper's burial in Silverton in 1975. The grave marker reads, "Unknown man, de circa 1907-1910. May he find peace." But even this was not quite the end of the story. Between 1910 and 1935, there were sporadic reports from trappers and hunters in the San Juan Mountains of a wild man living in the high country. Descriptions varied, but several common elements appeared in the accounts. A man living alone, avoiding contact, exhibiting extreme aggression if approached. In 1928, a trapper named Eugene Ward claimed he had been stalked for 3 days by someone or something in the mountains near the old Hartwell homestead area. Ward said he never got a clear look at his pursuer, but found evidence of camps and disturbing remains that suggested the person was living off the land in ways that weren't natural. Were these sightings related to Thomas Hartwell? Or were they simply the usual folklore that accumulates around any region of wilderness, especially one marked by tragedy? We will likely never know for certain. What we do know is that the legend of the Hartwell cabin has persisted in the San Juan Mountains for over a century. Old-timers in Silverton still tell stories about the cannibal siblings or the starving brother, though most of the specific details have been lost or distorted over time. The actual location of the cabin has been forgotten. The Forest Service map that would have shown it was lost in the courthouse fire of 1923. The land itself has reverted to wilderness. If you hike in that area today, you might pass within feet of where the cabin once stood and never know it. But sometimes, according to local hunters, you can still find strange things in those mountains. Old bones that don't quite look animal. Caves with markings scratched into the walls, places where the forest seems unnaturally silent, as though the land itself remembers what happened there. And every winter, when the snow begins to fall and the high country becomes inaccessible, once again, people in Silverton remember the Hartwells. They remember what isolation and hunger can do to human beings. They remember that civilization is a thin veneer, easily stripped away by cold and desperation. The mountains remember too, and perhaps in some dark corner of those peaks, Thomas Hartwell's spirit still wanders, forever hunting, forever hungry, forever unable to stop. The Hartwell case forces us to confront questions that have no easy answers. Were Thomas and Eleanor Hartwell victims or perpetrators? The answer, uncomfortably, is both. They were victims of circumstance, of geography, of a winter that trapped them in a situation no human being should ever face. But they were also perpetrators of acts that violated the deepest taboos of human society. The incest between the siblings troubles us not simply because of moral revulsion, but because it represents the collapse of the most fundamental family boundary. Thomas and Eleanor had been close since childhood. Perhaps too close. Their isolation in the mountains removed the social constraints that might have prevented them from crossing that line. And when they did cross it, when they sought comfort in each other's bodies during the darkest days of their ordeal, they set in motion a cascade of transgressions that culminated in horror. The pregnancy that resulted was, in Eleanor's own words, unexpected. She had not anticipated that consequence. And when she miscarried, perhaps due to malnutrition, perhaps due to the genetic risks inherent in incestuous conception, Thomas made a decision that defies moral comprehension. He fed his sister their dead child. This act alone would mark the Hartwell case as one of the most disturbing in American history. But Thomas did not stop there. Having crossed that ultimate line, having committed an act so transgressive that it existed beyond the pale of normal human morality, he found himself unable or unwilling to turn back. He became a hunter, a predator. He stalked and killed at least 2 men, possibly more, to provide meat for himself and his sister. And Eleanor, knowing or suspecting what the meat was, ate it anyway. This is the heart of the horror. Not simply that these acts occurred, but that they occurred within the context of love, of devotion, of a brother's promise to keep his sister alive. Thomas Hartwell was a monster. But he was a monster motivated by love. Does that make his crimes more understandable or more terrible? Eleanor Hartwell was a victim, but she was a victim who participated in her own victimization, who chose survival over morality, who ate human flesh and lived. Can we judge them? Should we judge them? The authorities of 1907 chose to bury the case rather than confront these questions publicly. They recognized that the Hartwell story offered no comfortable moral lessons, no clear villains and heroes. It offered only the disturbing truth that human beings, when pushed to extremity, are capable of anything. 3. Theories have emerged over the decades to explain the Hartwell case. The first theory is the simplest. Thomas and Eleanor were already engaged in an incestuous relationship before they moved to the mountains. They sought isolation specifically to pursue this relationship without judgment. The cannibalism was purely a function of survival once they became trapped. Thomas's subsequent murders were acts of desperation by someone already morally compromised. The second theory is more complex. It suggests that Thomas and Eleanor were relatively innocent before the winter of 1906 to 1907. Their relationship, while perhaps unusually close, did not cross into incest until the extremity of their situation broke down normal inhibitions. Once that line was crossed, subsequent transgressions became progressively easier. The case represents a step-by-step moral collapse rather than pre-existing depravity. The third theory is the darkest. It proposes that Thomas Hartwell was already a predator before the winter of 1906-1907, that he deliberately engineered the isolation and deprivation to create a situation where he could act on impulses he had long suppressed, that Eleanor was as much his victim as the men he later killed, that the entire tragedy was not an accident of circumstance, but a deliberate creation by a deeply disturbed individual. Which theory is correct? The evidence supports elements of all three. Eleanor's diary suggests genuine love between the siblings, but also hints at darkness that preceded their final winter. Thomas's apparent survival and continued predation after Eleanor's capture suggests someone who had crossed a line he could never uncross. We will never know the complete truth. Thomas Hartwell disappeared into the mountains and took his secrets with him. Eleanor Hartwell died in silence, her thoughts forever locked away. What remains is a story that disturbs us precisely because it cannot be easily categorized. It is not a simple tale of evil. It is Not a straightforward narrative of survival. It is something more complex and more troubling. It is a story about what we are capable of when everything else is stripped away, when society's rules no longer apply, when the only law is survival. The Hartwell cabin is gone, the people are dead, but the questions remain. And to this day, in the high country of the Colorado Rockies, there are places where the snow falls deep and the cold settles in, and people are reminded that civilization is fragile, that morality is conditional, and that inside every human being is the capacity for both profound love and unthinkable horror. The Hartwells found both, and it destroyed them. Now I want to hear from you. Which theory do you believe? Were the Hartwells victims of circumstance, or was there something darker at work from the beginning? Do extreme situations excuse otherwise unforgivable acts? Write your thoughts in the comments below. Join our haunted community by subscribing and ringing the notification bell. And remember, history is full of stories like this one, stories that were buried because they were too disturbing to confront. But we will keep digging, we will keep bringing these stories into the light. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember that the past is never as simple as we want it to be. Thank you for joining me on this dark journey.